I want to speak with you about the word on the screen there that you see before you. I want to speak with you about hope this morning. In Romans chapter 8, verse 24, Paul says, we have in hope been saved. And in verse 25, we hope for what we do not see. And so with perseverance, we eagerly wait for it. Hope is it's a key part of our existence, our faith in God, our knowledge of Him, our plans, why we do the things that we do. I don't want to start with a question that may seem pretty obvious, but I think it's a good question to start with. Anyway, why hope for heaven? What is it about heaven that makes it so worthy of our hope? Well, one thing that we could say about that is kind of a very basic reason. It's better than the alternative. And this is maybe, for a lot of us, kind of the first thing that made us take faith in God, Christianity seriously, is because we know that there's an alternative to heaven. In Hebrews chapter 10, verses 26 and 27, for if we go on sinning willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sin, but a certain terrifying expectation of judgment and the fury of a fire which will consume the adversaries. Well, obviously, none of us want that. Heaven's the alternative? Okay, heaven's where I want to be. So that's one reason that we hope in heaven. But it's really a pretty basic, elementary reason to hope in heaven. There are better reasons than that. Heaven is our home. Never been there. How could it be our home? But it is. Heaven is our home. It is where we belong. You know how when you go on a trip, and some of you may have traveled this past week like I did, and we enjoy all of that, but it's just good to get home, no? It's good to be home because there everything fits. There everything is the way that's pleasing to us. Things fit at home. You think back to the Garden of Eden. We belong there in the Garden of Eden. God created that space for Adam and Eve, for man to live in. And it had for him everything that he needed, much more than he needed. We rightfully refer to it as paradise. But it wasn't just the things that were there, but the presence of God was there, walking with them in the garden. And there was no conflict between man and God. That's the space that God made for His creation, man and woman, to live in, living there in harmony with God. And heaven is the restoration of that. It's not just the restoration of that. It's I think, a much more perfect version of that, where we dwell with God and everything that would be pleasing to us is there. Everything that makes life what it can and should be is part of what heaven is. It's a restoration, more perfect restoration of what was lost in the Garden of Eden. And so it's home. Sometimes we may have qualms about, I know it's going to be good, am I going to be happy there? You know, is it going to get old? I feel like I really fit in. Well, if we worry about fitting in, then there's probably some more basic things we need to be thinking about our own connection with the Lord and connection with our brethren. But still, we may kind of wonder, does that really fit me? Am I going to be happy there? Here is the place that we don't fit. Now, maybe we shape ourselves to fit this world, and that's unfortunate. But if we're the kind of people we ought to be, here is where we don't fit. I mean, you look at all the corruption, all the crime, all the people you can't trust, all the scam calls that come to your phone, all the frustrating things of this world because people are not what they should be. And we get the brunt end of that from people. This is where we don't belong. This is where it doesn't fit us. Conflicts between people, conflicts between us and other individuals, perhaps. Hopefully that's their fault and not our own. We see the perversion of good things. We see the wholesome way God has made us and wants us to live. And we see that twisted and perverted in so many ways around us. The distractions from the hope of heaven. The things that want to pull our attention away from God. This is where we don't fit. Heaven is where we fit. It's where we belong. It's what we were created for. In Matthew chapter 25, when Jesus is talking to the crowd about that final day, that day of judgment, when he will call before him all men. In Matthew chapter 25, verse 34, then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." God knew that we weren't going to last in Eden. And he had already prepared our future with him in heaven. He's made it for us. Philippians chapter 3, verse 20 says that our citizenship is in heaven. In Hebrews chapter 11, verses 13 and following, after talking about several of these heroes of faith here in the first half of chapter 11, how all these died in faith, verse 13, without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. One of the ones that the Hebrews author has talked about so far in this chapter is Abraham. You'll recall that he was natively of the city of Ur in the land of Chaldees, that southern Mesopotamia, southern what would later become known as Babylon. And he was called to go to this other land. And so he was in that sense a stranger in exile in this other land. But he's looking for something better than that. He's looking for this connection with God. All these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For those who say such things, make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And now the Hebrews author wants to point out, I'm not talking about Abraham wanting to go back over there. And indeed, if they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. If Ur of the Chaldees was the home that Abraham wanted to get back to, he could have simply gone. But that wasn't what he was looking for. Verse 16. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. It's what God established from the foundation of the world. It's where our citizenship is. It's what he has created for us, this city. That's why heaven is so worthy of our hope. Do you hope for that? Is that alive in your soul, hoping to be there? Do we ever pray, Lord, come quickly, because of our hope in heaven and being with him, with all the negative things of this world that are the result of sin. Past. Not just do you hope to avoid hell, but do you hope for heaven? It's amazing that our hope is sometimes weak, but we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. Before we get to that, I want to talk about the power of hope. What is the function of hope? What does it do for us? Well, it motivates us. It motivates us to work for the goal, to endure the various difficulties that come before us and interrupt our lives, conflict between people, heartaches and disappointments that come. I know that we all experience these things. Sometimes they are random. Sometimes they come because of our faith and our stand for what is true. But we've all been through difficulties and conflict and heartache and disappointment. And yet, this knowledge of being with the Lord in heaven, this hope for that, motivates us to go through those things. It motivates us to work for the goal, to endure those difficulties, to overcome those obstacles. Think about people who, a couple of hundred years ago, or more, 300 years ago, came from the old world over to the American continent because they were hoping in something. Now, I'm not wanting to convey the idea that America is our hope. In fact, that's the opposite of what I want us to think. But there was a hope in those people to get to a place that would be better for them. In many cases, it was for religious freedom. But it was a difficult passage. It was expensive to travel. The journey itself across the ocean was terribly difficult and unpleasant. And once you got here, unless you had a lot of money, but most people who came didn't have a lot of money, you had to find a way to make a living. And the earliest ones had to endure a harsh winter right after they got here and make it through that winter somehow before they could even grow crops. But they were willing to face those things because of their hope. One of my ancestors, I don't remember, I think it's 7 greats, my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, a man named John Howland, came over on the Mayflower. Now, that may seem remarkable. What if your ancestors came over on the Mayflower? Well, probably all of us. Because once you go down through this many generations, if you start tracing back, it's probably not unusual. But I'm lucky enough to know the name of the man and a little about him. And his journey over on the Mayflower. His name was John Howland. It's pretty easy to find him if you look him up because he fell off the Mayflower halfway across the ocean. He was down below where he had to be because of his status. But he was just so sick of being down below because it was an unpleasant journey. There was a lot of sickness. This happened to be in the midst of a storm. I don't know why he chose that time. Maybe that's because it got so frustrating. But he chose that time. I'm going up on the deck. I don't care what anybody says. And he got, with the ship tilting to and fro, he got swept overboard. He was lucky enough that one of the ropes from one of those tall halyards, because the ship was leaning, that rope was dangling down into the water, and he caught hold of that and made it back aboard the boat. But I say all of that to just highlight the difficulty of that journey and then the difficulty of their life here when they got here. And he came over as an indentured servant, which means he had to come, and for the first several years here, he had to be a servant to somebody to pay off the cost of the journey. Why would you want to do all of that? Hope. Because the hope of something that he saw as valuable. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, we see the difficulties that Paul endured. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, beginning in verse 23. He's responding in this passage to people who are boasting about whatever it is they're boasting about themselves. And Paul says, anybody can boast, and he begins to boast, but he's boasting about the undignified things he's had to experience. And so he says there in the midst of verse 23, in far more labors, in far more imprisonments, beaten times without number. You remember in Lystra where they beat him and left him for dead. He was beaten so bad. Beaten times without number, often in danger of death. All the times that he had to escape the city because they were about to stone him, or in fact had stoned him. Often in danger of death. 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I am spent in the deep. I've been on frequent journeys and dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my own countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers on the sea, dangers among false brethren. I've been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. That's not the life that you picture for yourself. Yeah, that's what I want. But he endured all of these things. Furthermore, he says in verse 28, apart from such external things, there's the daily pressure upon me of concern for the churches. Who's weak without my being weak? Who's led into sin without my intense concern? No time to just selfishly take a cruise. Paul endured a lot. We see in verses 28 and 29, I read my wrong reference here. Chapter 4, verses 8 and 9. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 8 and 9. But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that is the surpassing greatness of the power may be of God and not from ourselves. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not despairing. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. Yeah, they endured a lot. Paul did, and his companions did, and the faithful of the first century did endure a lot. But it didn't defeat them because of hope. And so we see in verses 16 to 18, therefore we do not lose heart, but though our outer man is decaying, yet our inner man is being renewed day by day. For momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison, while we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are not seen are temporal. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. Paul doesn't use the word hope in those 3 verses, but hope is what those 3 verses are all about. Yes, it's difficult, but inside we have this hope that drives us forward. And that's why Paul, although he was afflicted, was not crushed. Although he was perplexed, he didn't despair. Although he was persecuted, he didn't feel forsaken, and he wasn't forsaken. Although he got struck down, he was not destroyed because of this hope. Because the things that we suffer here, though they seem large and so difficult and sometimes so very painful, and few of us can match, the difficulties that Paul has just described that he's gone through. Though they are so painful, look at Paul and how he's able to describe them. Light affliction. Just light affliction. It's not much. How do you say that? How do you say that, Paul? Because he sees the comparison. This momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. You can't compare the greatness of the hope with the difficulty of the challenges. It's just no comparison. So that hope allows us to see things that way and allows us to get through the difficulties that we face. That's what hope does for us. So that at the end, when Paul writes his last letter, at least the last letter that we have from him, I suppose it's possible he may have written somebody else after he wrote this final letter to Timothy. But it's the last one that we have, 2 Timothy chapter 4, shortly before he's about to be executed by the Romans. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. Because Paul chased his hope, he was able to say this. Verses 7 and 8. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. In the future there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, he says, but also to all who have loved his appearing. That's the power of hope. That's a wonderful thing. That's a strong, powerful thing. It's a great blessing, and a great force, and a great tool in our toolbox to focus on this hope. We'll talk about focusing on that hope right at the end of the lesson. That's the power of hope. And yet, as wonderful as all of that is, sometimes our hope is overthrown and vanquished by the substitution of some other hope. The kind of ease of life that we have in this country and at this time, it's easy to just be very comfortable with our lives and begin to just anticipate all the goodness that we have here and to focus on those things, to fall in love with all the things that we can have, all the things that we can do, without going into expensive things that we might be wanting to buy. Just our home, the nice home that we have, and fixing up the home that we have, and making everything in the home that we have nice the way we want it. And our families are a good thing. Homes are a good thing too. Families are a good thing. And there's goodness in them, and that goodness is designed by God, but sometimes that can become our idol. That can become our hope. Spending time with our family, our plans with our family, the activities of our family, and those become the thing that becomes our first choice in life. Lots of things in this world can become the things that we really look forward to and anticipate and hope for and enjoy as we have them, but sometimes they become such a great part of our hope that it begins to destroy our hope for heaven. We need to remember that. We become so focused on these other things that our heavenly hope becomes overthrown. I know we're still involved with the Christian part of our lives. We're still involved with the church. But remember that Paul would probably never say the Christian part of my life. Because his Christianity, his faith in the Lord was everything. And that was his life because of his hope in heaven. And he didn't allow those other things to creep in and to overpower and to vanquish that hope in heaven. There's a way that churches have played a big part in this destroying of heavenly hope. We talk sometimes about the social gospel as churches emphasize all the satisfaction of our temporal needs, the needs in this life. And many churches don't do this, but many churches do. Their main focus becomes all of the physical concerns of life in this world and making them better. And so there are food drives to help people have the food that they need. Now, helping people with food is a good thing. I don't want to diminish that. And there's hospital funding, and there's entertainment for the kids, and giving them a place to come in the afternoon and play, and you know, all of these things. I remember, I may have mentioned it here recently, I mentioned it somewhere recently, that I got a call one time from a lady who'd somehow come across information about the church I was working with at the time, and her main question was, what do you have to offer? And you know, she was asking about things of this world, rather than, well, salvation, the knowledge and forgiveness of God. But churches have fed into that, and this life becomes the hope of people, even when they think they're serving the Lord. Or whether it's a church or not, we just individually make that same mistake of focusing on the here and now and little on the hereafter. So the last thing I want to leave on your minds is to focus on that hope, that joy set before us. Focus on that. I want to mention a few categories of people that really focused on the hope of heaven. First category of people I want to mention are slaves of the American past, the 17th and 18th centuries. They didn't have much. They had very little. They didn't even have their own freedom. They had discomfort and mistreatment. But you think back to what we know about those people, and they would sing spiritual songs of the Lord as they worked, because they hoped. They didn't have any of the things that would draw their focus away from that spiritual hope, and so they hoped in the Lord. Chinese Christians. My parents spent some time in China, and so I know a little about those brethren over there. You know, some of them have been arrested, some of them have been thrown into prison, some of them have been separated from their spouses by the government there. But they continue to serve the Lord because they have hope. Guatemalan Christians. My niece and her husband are family. They worked with brethren in Guatemala several years ago for a period of several years. I got to go down there and visit. And I remember meeting this one family. Hilmar, I don't remember Hilmar's last name, but it doesn't matter. He and his wife and his 3 young children lived in a house that we would maybe not call a house. That had a piece of corrugated metal braced by 3 2x4s, so it would be rigid for the door of this structure. There was corrugated metal for the ceiling, for the roof. There wasn't a ceiling and a roof. There was just that piece of corrugated metal across the top of the structure with some holes in it. So when it rained, the water would no doubt drip through onto the dirt floor of their home. And I could go on, but that's enough of a picture of their home. It did have 3 rooms to it. And he worked making fabric. He had a loom there in a shed outside their home in the middle of these cornfields where they live. And he said, I could have gotten a better job in the city, a more well-paying job in the city. And, you know, he had the intellect to do that. But he said he didn't choose that better, more high-paying job because he wanted to be able to have time to work and study with the fellow Christians there. He wanted to have time to reach people who were lost. He wanted to be able to have time to travel to different cities on Sundays and to preach for them as well. Nomar was not the preacher of the congregation there. He was just a man who hoped in heaven and lived that way. Christians in Zimbabwe. I wish I could remember right now the name of the man that I want to mention. He's a preacher in Bowling Green, Kentucky, if any of you might think of who that is and has done some traveling. Bob Buchanan, thank you, appreciate it. He talked about his journey to Zimbabwe and to preach there and have people, you know, the economy is not good in Zimbabwe. It hasn't been for a very long time. And the people have very little to eat. But they would travel miles and miles over a mountain on foot to come and stay for 2 or 3 days to hear the gospel preached. They were hungry enough that they gave Bob some of the chicken that they had brought with them, specifically to provide for him. And when he finished eating his chicken, he had not finished it. You and I would say he had finished it. He thought he had finished it. But some of the girls there asked, are you going to eat the bones? And he said no. And so they did. They didn't have much in this world to draw their attention away from their hope in heaven. And so they walked for miles and miles to hear the gospel preached, because that's where their hope was. Keep your eyes not on the things of this world, the things that we enjoy, the things that occupy our time. Stay focused on the hope of heaven. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, the author of Hebrews is picturing a foot race in the ancient Greek and Roman world with crowds in the stands cheering the runners on. And the cloud of witnesses he refers to here are all those heroes of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. Since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, and then see Jesus as the example of doing this, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. He had a hope before him, a joy set before him, and we do as well. He endured the things that needed to be endured. He laid aside the things that were going to slow him down because of that hope. As we make our choices in life, the heroes of faith in Hebrews chapter 11 are in the stands cheering us on. You can do this. Remember the hope of heaven. Let that drive us forward. In a moment, we're going to stand and sing our song of invitation. If you have some need this morning to come forward, we ask that you do so as we stand and sing.
Who will follow Jesus, standing for the right?